Alright, so I just did some experiments over at a university. I discovered something funny, and I'll read to you what I wrote. The funny thing about conquering fear is that they recede as you chase them, and you can't really vanquish them if they're gone. So I noticed that as I'm trying to do things to conquer my fear, it's almost like they're running away, and here's what happens. There's that fear that you want to get to. But once you start taking the action in order to conquer that fear, your mind starts justifying, it starts rationalizing reasons why you shouldn't be afraid. To me, that doesn't mean that you've conquered your fear, it just means you've rationalized it away. It's receded, it's gone. It's gone from that situation because you can no longer see it there. You're no longer, once you justify the situation, once you rationalize the situation, you're no longer doing it in spite of being afraid. You're just no longer afraid anymore. You've learned to do that without being afraid. And what that means is that you've just never actually faced your fear. It kind of works like this. Because that thing that you were afraid of has been rationalized away. The reason why you were afraid of doing that action, you no longer have that reason. Because you've seen the situation in a different light. So that reason that you were afraid of committing from performing that action that you're afraid of doing, you're still afraid of committing that, but you just no longer see it in that situation, in that action that you're performing now. So we have a couple of things now, because both of these actions, the rationalization, the justification of an action, and you taking action and you rationalizing the situation, and you taking action and not rationalizing the situation and actually facing your fear, those two actions are included in the enjoyment, in the third element, enjoyment. One of them is called natural attainment, and that's enjoyment via rationalization, justification. And the other one is called self-sufficiency, and that's enjoyment just by itself. You're just trying to enjoy the sensation that you have right now without imagining things, without imagining that you have already the thing that you're looking for. So there's two types of enjoyment. There is narrative-dependent enjoyment, which is natural attainment, and narrative-independent enjoyment, which is self-sufficiency. Now, this concept of narrative-dependent, narrative-independence is something that I thought of a month ago, but right now it became clear. I'm sure it was clear when it passed through my mind the first time, but right now that I experienced this, and I put a name to it before I came to the narrative dependence and narrative independence, the connection is more clear now. So those are two types of enjoyment. The one that depends on narrative, I consider that a cop-out. I consider that kind of like a cheat. Because you're not really assimilating, you're not really facing your fear, you just rationalize it away. So I'm gonna have to remove that from the enjoyment element, natural attainment. It was such a good idea, and it's good, but I'm not going to remove it just yet, but I have to analyze it to see if it actually belongs there, or if it's a shortcut to facing your fear, to actually enjoying what you have. As far as self-sufficiency, that seems to be more elemental because it gets more into enjoyment, that actual fear. It gets more into enjoying that actual sensation that you have that is a response to fear. And I think that is more essential, that is more elemental to enjoyment, because you're not just rationalizing away that fear, you're just not rationalizing away the pain, you're actually trying to enjoy the pain, you're actually trying to be at peace with that sensation of pain. That's narrative-dependent enjoyment, that's natural attainment, and narrative-independent enjoyment, that's self-sufficiency, part of enjoyment. The use of narrative. So there is a place in which narrative is used in the system, and that is when that's when you come up with a purpose, when you're trying to accomplish a purpose. That's in the concave element. And so that's why at first I saw this as concave, the rationalization justification, concave versus enjoyment. That's what I was seeing this phenomena as far as facing your fear and it receding. When it recedes, when you justify it, that's concave because your mind is coming up with a purpose in order to comfort you. And enjoyment, that's just you enjoying the sensation. So concave, enjoyment, rationalization, and actually facing your fear, soaking in the sensation of stress. Narrative-dependent enjoyment, or natural attainment, and narrative-independent enjoyment, that is self-sufficiency. So it's going to be pretty tricky to conquer your fear if it keeps running away like this, especially because your mind tends to do this automatically. Once you do something enough, your mind tries to make sense of the situation, and you do this without giving it the cue to do it. It just happens like that. And I noticed this as it kind of stressed me out in the moment because I was trying to face my fear, but I noticed that doing that thing was actually easier. And it wasn't because I faced my fear. I still felt an emptiness inside. That's how it all started. I was trying to face my fear, but even though I was doing the action that I was afraid to do, I still felt an emptiness inside. I still felt like I wasn't accomplished. And it was because of that. It was because I had rationalized the situation in order so that I wouldn't be afraid of it anymore. And so I was no longer afraid to do it, even though I hadn't really conquered my fear. So that's how it all started. Right now, I'm trying to think of a way to actually face my fear, to actually not rationalize the situation, still be afraid of the situation, and still do it. As I'm trying to think of a way to do that, I kind of try to imagine what it would be like to actually catch that moment of fear, to actually catch that sensation of fear. You know, to actually step into, just like with sheer will, with sheer courage, just step into that stress and to be caught up in it. And as I think about that, as I try to imagine that situation, I wonder if it just means stress, if it just means pain, if it just means like the emotional pain that I've been experiencing, that I experience every time I wake up, every time I decide to soak in my thoughts and just kind of like dwell on my problems. It's probably the exact same thing, except one of them, it's fear in anticipation, it's pain in anticipation, and the other one is pain in being present in that thing that you don't like. So I'm thinking that they're both fear responses. They're both responses as you don't want to be in that situation, but one of them is you're going to be in that situation and you don't want it, so that's fear. And the other one is you don't want to be in that situation and you're in it. That's pain. That's emotional pain. So I'm thinking that being in pain means that you caught fear. But I'm still going to analyze that. I'm gonna put a note here to make sure that one is actually the other, to make sure that fear and pain are just different angles of the same thing. I still need to analyze that. So I'm going to put a note there. But what would that mean? That means that as of now, I am actually facing my fear. I'm actually caught up in fear that because I am waking up stressed and I'm going to sleep stressed and I'm having nightmares. So that means that I'm actually making a good effort to do that. That means that I've actually caught my fear in certain areas of life. So that's good. That's progress. I'm glad that I'm making progress. The next step now is to actually enjoy the sensation. That will be defined as performing self-sufficiency. To be in that state of stress and be calm within that state of stress. Yeah. So if they're the same thing, then I'm actually already doing it. But even though I'm facing my fear in those areas of my life that I'm being stressed about, that doesn't mean that there are other, just being able to face your fear doesn't mean that you're no longer afraid of anything. I'm still afraid of other things, which I haven't caught the fear of. So I need to put myself in a situation in which I am constantly stressed out about the thing that I've done. You know, if I'm actually looking to face my fear, I need to do that thing that I'm afraid of, but do it in a way that it'll stick with me. So that it's no longer that I'm afraid of that it's going to happen, but that I'm stressing out that it has already happened and that there's nothing I can do to get rid of it. Once I'm in that situation, then I'll be in constant emotional pain, and that's when that will mean that I've caught the fear, and that'll mean that the only thing I have to do there would be to enjoy the sensation of being stressed out. Self-sufficiency. Yeah. So that is, I guess, all in all, this is all an effort to practice and learn how to perform self-sufficiency type of enjoyment. As I see my being stressed out, right? So that's an area of my life in which I've actually caught the fear. I haven't conquered it through self-sufficiency, but I've actually caught it. So that means that in order for me to be truly free, I need to conquer my fear. I need to first catch and conquer my fear in every area of my life that I'm afraid of going into, that I'm afraid of messing up. So that means that I would have to, in order to catch the fear, I would have to screw up in every way that I can imagine in my life, so that I could be in that state of constant stress and be stressed about every aspect of my life. Be stressed so much that it kind of like encompasses every inch of my brain, every inch of my mind, all the dark corners of my mind. And then learn to accept that stress, learn to enjoy that stress. Either that, so that's scenario one. Scenario two, me being completely liberated would mean not that I have to perform everything that I'm afraid of, so that I would catch fear in every situation. Not so that I would be stressed about every aspect of my life, but simply to master performing self-sufficiency. So that if I master performing self-sufficiency, if it just comes automatic to me, if it just comes naturally to me, whenever stress shows up, whenever fear comes up, then that means that I don't have to perform. I don't have to screw up my life in every aspect. I don't have to perform the action that I'm afraid of in order to conquer that fear, because if it were to happen, I already know how to take care of it. I already know how to enjoy the sensation of stress. I already know how to enjoy the sensation of fear. So I wouldn't have to get into it. So I'm thinking it might be the second scenario, just because it makes more sense. It's not that you have to screw up your life in every imaginable way. But if you just learn, if you just master how to perform self-sufficiency, then you won't need to go through the infinite spectrum of problems. You're just ready because you have enjoyment. You have what it takes. If anything were to happen, you would be ready for it in every way. So you don't need to exhaust the infinite amount of possibilities that you're afraid of. You just need to master enjoyment, so that if anything were to happen, whatever that anything may be, you would conquer your fear successfully. You would vanquish your fear successfully. Now, as I was rationalizing the action that I was afraid of, I kind of find myself thinking about an unfavorable scenario, and it's just something that I thought about, that I guess could be a possibility and could explain some people's behavior. But what if, as I'm chasing fear, my capacity to rationalize, to justify the situation, the action that I'm doing, kind of surpasses my capacity to fear? You know, I get better at rationalizing before I could even fear the thing, before I could even accept the fear. I started wondering, what would I do in that situation? You know, I kind of have to stunt myself from developing my capacity to rationalize and to justify in order for me to catch the fear. But in a situation in which I'm always chasing fear and I rationalize it before I get to it, that means that I would have to do worse and worse things in order for me to be able to catch that fear. It kind of ends up being kind of like an adrenaline junkie, you know, an adrenaline junkie that gets desensitized to some actions, and so he needs to perform riskier and riskier actions in order to get that same fix. Until, you know, things get so risky that he dies. You know, I mean, you can't have a risk without a danger of actually dying. So that would be my fate if I were to go that route. You know, get into riskier and riskier situations until things actually become risky, but I'm no longer afraid of it because, you know. And so, you know, in order for me to capture the fear, I would need to get into worse and worse situations. So in my head I was thinking, like, well, to what extent will I have to go to if this keeps happening? And, you know, it would go through bad extents. I would end up literally ruining my life. In maybe permanent ways. Other than that, you might ask yourself, besides it not getting to the root, what's so bad about rationalizing and justifying an action in order for you to conquer your fear? Can't rationalizing and justifying the situation so that the fear is out of the way, can't that be enough? Isn't that practically enough? I mean, if your only purpose is to perform that action, then yeah, you can rationalize the fear away and justify the fear away. And so that will never be a problem. Now you can justify that fear. I mean, now you can perform that action without fear. If your goal is to challenge fear itself, then you will need to challenge fear itself. But even if your goal is not to challenge fear itself, but just to perform that action, it would still do you good to challenge fear itself, because the weakness in rationalizing away your fear is Murphy's Law. If you are depending on a situation to be a certain way in order for you to be able to perform it, you can be sure that your limitations will soon catch up to you in possibly the worst times. So it's best for you to conquer fear itself than just to conquer that situation, because if you rationalize the fear, that means that if you rationalize the situation, that means that the situation has to be within your rationalization, within your justification, in order for it to be harmless.
Every movement implies a risk! Every movement destroys your world! The whole world hates from a thin string! With a twitch of a finger, you can lose everything!